Welcome everybody to another Sunday night watercolour session. In this session we're going to handle a simple landscape, which I am just going to quickly sketch out, and then we will start laying down our first washes. So for this landscape we're just going to have a simple cloudy sky, a dominant hill holding together the main part of the composition, falling over to some distant hills and forms in the background. Trees will line this space. And then what we're going to have is a focal tree holding the whole composition together over in this third. Sketching in the basic shapes of the tree this time around. I'll take a little bit of time just to lay in some of the key branches before we get started, as this pencil work will still show through as we work our washes over the top. We'll have some little bushes off in the background. Running through these paddocks here. And that's pretty much all we need to get started. So it's going to lay down a base wash for our cloudy sky. Just taking a varnish brush here with some water, wetting the area, going to just go in a little bit against the edge of these background hills as well. Just gives me some working space. You can see the gleam on the paper here. Now, to get us going, I'm just going to grab some ultramarine blue. Reasonably loaded up. I've got some reds and things on the palette here, as you can see. I'm just going to mix in with a little bit of the pyrrole red I've got here too. I've got a touch of yellow on the palette. We're going to use that just to dirty the mix a little bit. And we're just going to float in some cloud forms. Not completely covering the paper, we want to let areas of this breathe and bleed. And a little bit of a purpley mix happening in here as well. We'll utilise that for some stronger contrast against a closer cloud here. Now when you're working wet and wet, you have to be very careful about your approach. Laying down pigment like what I've just done, if we're to bring anything else in subsequent layers, you need to make sure that you have enough pigment in that load. Don't thin it down too much, because what will happen is it will break down quite considerably. I'm just going to wash in a little bit of ultra in through the background section here, just behind the clouds themselves. Now I'm not touching the edges of where we've just brought our cloud forms in. I will bring in some little touches into the areas where we have our whites, but I also want to retain some of those whites as well. With our distant mountain, I'm just going to get a stronger mix of ultra going. and that way I can bring this in. Needs a little bit of purple, so I'm just going to grab some of the crud that I've got on the palette here. Haven't cleaned it from the previous painting. Just going to work that edge. It'll fuzz and fade a little bit, and that's what I'm looking for. A couple of accents there to create a bit of depth. While we are going, I'm just going to give the palette a quick wipe down. Clear some fresh space, and we're going to work some warmer grasses in the foreground area to give us a contrast against that grey sky. So taking a very big brush here, I'm just going to work up to that boundary, or somewhere in that area anyway. Into this, I take a little bit of my lemon yellow. Very, very thin pass here. Just wanting to get that glow through the space. And from there, we're going to start dirtying that. So all I'm doing is taking a little bit of my new gamboge, which for all intents and purposes we'll class that as our cad yellow deep, with some more ultra. We end up with this nice browny mix, and this will be what holds a lot of the foreground together. I just want to increase the pigment load here. That's better. So a much richer hit of colour through this space, leaving a couple of pockets such as this for that light to gravitate to. Into that we can just grab a touch of the ultra with a little bit of our magenta, throw that into the same mix, and we're just going to run in some darker marks. Because the paper is nice and wet through this space, it's going to granulate quite considerably. We're going to get that softer fuzz. And the focus really pulls to the tree when we get all this sorted. Now we will give this a few minutes to dry because we need to just get that background area sitting nicely before we bring our next pass through. Okay, we've given this about 5 minutes to dry off. Our background area is now starting to sit down, which is good. What we're going to do, we're going to take our murky golden mix that was used through the foreground. This is going to be the mother color for a lot of this picture. I'm just going to bring a touch of that over to the other side of the palette and mix that in with our blues, adding a bit more ultra to the mix as the shadow from all that cloud cover is going to fall down across our back hill here. So I'm actually just coming in with the mix already on the brush, dipping it in the water and then dragging across the paper so I get a very thin pass of the colour. Into that I can throw little touches of the stronger variations as well. and just bluing it back a little bit more as we head over to this side. As I said, this is our dominant hill. We're going to have some tree lines coming across it. So at this point we're just going to start working some little sharper forms in against some of the stuff we've got here. This isn't necessarily the finished pass, it's just setting up the shapes for when we come through on that next glaze of colour. This little touch of light that we have is going to grab a touch more lemon yellow, very, very thinly, and a little bit of the new gamboge. Working them together, thinning them right out. I want this to be a super thin mix. You can even just add the tiniest touch of magenta to it, which gives us a nice warmth to the colour. And that will come through along the base of the hill. So once I get that first pass in, then I just break it down with some water. I'm looking for contrast against what we've already got. Creating that band of light through the background trees. A lot of this process tonight is going to be putting it in, letting it dry, moving on to the next. I'm just going to put a suggestion of a hill over in the background here as well. We've got a tree line that sits across this foreground hill. I'm just going to drag in some darker marks which will help to set up our tree forms. At this point our foreground's starting to dry out. Probably leave it a little bit longer. We might just give it a few minutes and then we'll come back and continue the next pass. We've given this a chance to dry. All of the major areas are now starting to take shape. It's now time to start building depth in our areas. So cloud forms I'm really happy with. That all works quite nicely. We are going to strengthen this background hill a little bit more. For that I'm just going to take the same yellow magenta ultra mix that I've got on the palette here, keeping it reasonably watery. I'm just going to glaze that back over the top in a wet on dry wash. So using the wet paint on the dry paper, you can see it's already impacting our foreground section. The light coming through the flat part of the paddocks there is starting to increase, which is great. Just going to fix up this little bit down here. Going to blue this mix off a touch more, so I'm just going to grab a touch more ultra and throw it into this puddle. Just to cool it down. That little bit that I've just put in there, I'll then just take some water in and break up a little bit more as well. I find when it comes to watercolour, if you can, the best way to treat it is like a jigsaw puzzle. So being able to move from section to section as things dry off just gives you a bit more scope to play. You don't have to wait for drying times quite so much. So I'm just picking up the dual yellows, so my lemon yellow, new gamboge, with the touch of magenta that I've got there. I'm I'm just going to start throwing some stronger variations into our foreground section here. Just picking up around the tree point, as that's where I want the eye to work itself through. Now we're just going to thin the mix down a touch and use a couple of very simple little diagonal strokes to get that colour a bit richer in the foreground. You can see immediately this wedge that we have here is just illuminating. We're going to thin the wedge down a touch. Just using a thinner mix of this colouring with a little bit more lemon yellow in it. While I'm working through here, we're just going to grab some Pyrrole Red. Cad Red does the same thing. Phthalo Blue. And a little bit of the New Gamboge. And this mix needs a bit more blue in it. So we'll bring some blue in on the side here. This becomes my little dark mix that I work. So we're just going to throw a couple of contrasting marks through here. This just gets some background bushes in. I like the fact that it is going to craze and bleed a little bit through this section. It just gives us a bit of scope to play. You can see that the paint is going down quite inky, but it will separate, so it's okay to let the tip of the brush bounce around a little bit. Even going to blue that down a touch more. Now, as those marks dry, they're going to soften down. You can also just get there and drop a tiny bit more water in against them to fuzz them. So the scene's starting to map out. Paper's just a little bit damp back here, but I can work with that. This mix is strong enough that it'll hold to the damp paper. I'm going to use the bluer variation of this mix. I'm thinning it down a little bit more than what we used in the foreground, but we're just going to create some stronger tree forms up on this ridge. Not going to come down too far because we've got some stronger trees holding the foreground together here. We're just going to through the cooler mix through for contrast against the real distant hills that we've got here. So those ultra blue pieces that we put in earlier are now going to sit back. As you increase the depth with each mix, you're going to find those areas that look dark to start off with actually become quite light. So it's a case of just working through the process. Don't want too much happening behind our main tree. I'm keeping it quite simple. On this side we do have a tree line, so I'm just going to blue that off a touch more. I'm going to use a bit of ultra into the mix here. And just a drop more water. Granulation of the ultra is just starting to come through a little bit, which is nice. If you're enjoying these little video tutorials, remember that I do run workshops and classes throughout the year via Zoom, so no matter where you are in the world, you're more than welcome to sign up. I do have a range of video workshops that have been running for the last couple of years. You can download all the workshop materials as well. So if you have any questions regarding those, shoot me an email. I'd be more than happy to get there and help you out with that. While I'm doing watercolor ones here, as you can see through the rest of my profile, I pretty much handle everything. So handling the landscape for these sort of things is a great way for people to get started in watercolor. But I also get there and do wildlife work. I handle scratchboard. I do pastel work, oils and acrylics. If you want to learn how to do something, there is a high possibility I have a workshop or demonstration to help you with that subject. So once we get this tree run in here, then I'm just going to strengthen the mix and we'll begin to work our front tree line. So with this next section, we pick up our more brown mix here. We're going to throw a little bit more lemon yellow into this and a touch more ultra. We don't want it to be too green, we're just looking for that greyed brown quality. So through the back here we have quite a considerable tree line. I'm not going to do it as a full tree line, I'm actually going to break it into little sections, having some clearings. And the warmer colour versus that cooler initial pass, it just jumps a little bit more, which is good. Putting in the clumps of foliage like this. As we move toward the outer edge, we're going to cool it down, so just grabbing a touch of phthalo, not too much. I've got some red on the palette here as well, which I'll use to grey it off. And that will help us as we work our way off to the edge here. Straighten this up. Now very carefully, just taking this brush, we're just going to bring in some trunks. And you can do this with a liner if you feel more comfortable. You can see as I drag the brush through, it just picks up the wet paint we've already got going and tapers that mark, which is quite nice. Don't want too much happening behind our focal tree here that is yet to go in, but I'm just going to work in toward the edges of it. A little bit more golden again as we come across. Then following that, we're just going to throw a touch of our Pyrrole red back into that mix. And very gently just run a shadow line underneath the trees. I want it a little bit haphazard. I'm not trying to keep it clean. I want these marks to bleed and blur and move around, filter down into the other areas. You can see now that it's drying off, some of these marks are actually getting quite red. I'm going to pick up a bit more of the bluer mixes we've got and strengthen the contrasts again. Off our hero tree, we're just going to start creating some playful marks to show some shadow on the ground. Setting up what's going to happen with that form as we bring that next layer in. You can see just how that light across the back pass really starts to leap now. We're going to take full advantage of that. We're just grabbing some more ultra, a little bit of our blue red mix with a touch of the murky stuff. Just creates a nice neutral grey. Off in the distance we're going to have an old hay shed. little basic forms to grab the eye and drag you back in. Keeping them really simple. This is a very small scale, as you can see, but there's a lot going on even at this point. We'll let it dry for a moment and then we will come back, put in our main tree and finish it off. Okay, we've given this a few minutes to dry. You can see that the trees are starting to sit down a little bit more. What we're going to do now is just grab a smaller brush, just a small round, and we will mix up a dark. So for my key dark that I normally work with, it is Pyrrole Red. As I said, you can use Cad Red, does the same thing. Phthalo Blue. Depending on which way you push these two colours as to which way it leans. It does make a violet, but it does have a very dark, dirty undertone to it. And I'm just going to take a touch of lemon yellow to this. Really good, strong dark mix that is very, very simple to make. So we are now just going to come in on those branches we drew in earlier. And start feathering them out, getting the forms in play. You can probably hear the ice cream truck in the background. It is a summer's night, so they're doing what they can to get all the kids running. So you can see immediately the contrast we're getting off this tree against all those other elements. Unlike the background trees where I got there and did the foliage first and then dragged the branch or the trunks down from there. We're just coming in with the trunk forms first on this. This same dark can just come through in places to strengthen some of the background ones. Not everywhere, just in places. Now we are just going to get a very thick mix. So this is quite neat. Paint very sticky at this point. Out of my pan here. I work from tubes, but I put them onto my palette and treat them as pans. I just find it works best for the way I approach my paintings. So for this, we're just coming in with this very thick mix of the dark with a little bit more lemon yellow to get a real green undertone to it. I'm going to add a touch of the new Gamboge into that as well. I feel it needs a bit more lift. See, that tree's really starting to come forward. The stronger colours make a huge difference when it comes to this. We'll bring in some key darks again. So for that, just doing the same. Pyrrole Red, Phthalo mix. I've already got the yellow on the palette, so I can work that in. Just to throw some stronger, richer darks in to hold it together. And that tree really has a lot of impact now. It's going to take some neat lemon yellow now. And just knock some of the really dark sections in. The whole point is we want the background to glow like it is at this point. This tree really needs to come forward. And everything in the background you can see just sort of fades off and becomes quite hazy, which is quite nice. This tree run here, I wouldn't mind just getting there and bluing off and giving another layer of paint to. I feel it's a little bit too crisp. So I'm just going to glaze over the top with a little bit of water first, just to activate that area. Utilizing what I've got on the palette already, just bluing it off a touch more with the Ultra Mix as opposed to the CAD, as opposed to the Phthalo. So my palette is built around a dual primary color theory. So each primary color has a color bias, and what I do with my palette is I utilize that bias to create contrast using temperature. This area is probably a bit too strong. We're just going to blot that back for a second. That's better. And blot both areas back a little bit. A bit of paper towel doesn't hurt to have on board just every now and again to knock areas down if needed. It's got too much colour in it for that area. Just strengthening the background tree line here with a little bit more blue. And then dabbing back. And that pretty much sees us right for this little demo. Again, thank you for watching. I'll be back next week with something completely different. If you'd like to see a particular subject or a particular medium done, shoot me a comment. Shoot me a message in the comments. I'll be more than happy to get there and see what I can come up with for you. In the meantime, it's time to sign.